When I first arrived at Camp Graywater, I thought it was just another paycheck, a summer gig meant to pad my pockets before I figured out what to do with my life. But the moment the pine air hit my lungs and I saw the crooked signs swinging on rusted chains, I knew something about this place carried a weight I couldn't explain. Like the camp itself was waiting for me in particular. The director, a thin woman with sharp shoulders and lips pressed too tightly together, greeted me with a nod instead of a smile, and handed me a laminated card with 4 rules typed in bold. Rules she said every counselor was expected to follow without exception. After sunset, every mirror in camp had to be covered with black cloth. No one was to ever answer if their name was called from the lake after midnight. 1 bunk in every cabin must remain empty with salt sprinkled along its seams every night. And finally, when the old iron bell rang at exactly 3:13 a.m., you had to lie face down, completely still, and never look at the door until the bell stopped. I chuckled under my breath, thinking it was all some strange hazing ritual or a bit of local folklore to scare newcomers. But when I looked around at the other counselors, veterans who had returned year after year, their faces were serious, almost grim, as though these rules had been carved into their bones, and no one dared joke about them. My cabin assignment was Juniper, an old wooden building with paint peeling from its sides and windows that felt just slightly too tall, as though they'd been meant for another structure altogether. And inside, the bunks smelled of cedar and dust, the mattresses thin, the floorboards creaking with every tentative step. But what unsettled me most was the designated empty bunk at the far end, bare except for a white seam of salt glowing faintly under the dim light, a bed that seemed to watch the rest of us instead of waiting to be used. I unpacked quickly, ignoring the uneasy silence that clung to the cabin when the sun began to set, and grabbed the stack of black cloth squares the director had given me, each one cut the same size with small brass eyelets for nails, then began making rounds to cover the mirrors in the bathrooms, wardrobes, and even a small hand mirror I found in a drawer with yellowing ribbons curled inside like forgotten keepsakes. The other counselors passed me by in silence, carrying their own stacks of cloth and salt tins, nodding occasionally but never speaking, as if words after dusk were too expensive to waste. By the time I finished, the last traces of daylight had slipped behind the pine ridge, and the camp seemed to breathe differently, like the earth itself had exhaled and left us hanging in its lungs. And I realized this wasn't a summer camp like the ones I remembered from childhood. It was a place where children came to laugh and swim in the daylight while adults worked feverishly to keep something else, something nameless, out during the night. As I sat on my bunk with a flashlight in my phone, scrolling through old messages just to tether myself to a normal world, I could hear the lake shifting in the distance, water lapping against the dock in uneven rhythms like it was practicing a language. And I told myself it was just the wind, just physics, just nature being unpredictable. But deep inside, a knot of fear began to form. And though I was too proud to admit it then, I already understood why the rules existed. They weren't a joke, they weren't a campfire story. They were the only thing standing between us and something that watched from the water, waiting for one of us to slip.
That first night stretched longer than any I'd lived through before. Not because anything dramatic happened immediately, but because of the way time seemed to thicken. Every minute syrup slow, as though the air itself wanted to trap me in it. And I remember lying on my bunk in Juniper cabin, staring up at the shadows of rafters bending across the ceiling, telling myself over and over that the rules were silly camp traditions meant to make wide-eyed rookies like me uneasy. But the conviction didn't hold when I realized I had forgotten one of them. I had carefully nailed cloth over the bathroom mirror, checked the wardrobe door, even searched under bunks for stray glass. But when Ro, the climbing instructor, barged in without knocking around 1 in the morning, she went straight to the sink, pressed her palm against the bare oval mirror I had somehow overlooked, and gave me a look I will never forget. Not angry, not smug, but hollow, like disappointment mixed with warning. And without a word, she took the cloth from my stack, nailed it over the glass with the heel of her hand, and whispered, "It starts the second you arrive," before leaving as abruptly as she had entered. I lay there, wide-eyed, the generator outside sputtering into silence a few minutes later, the camp plunging into a depth of quiet that didn't feel like absence, but presence. And I tried to breathe through it, tried to ignore the way the boards under my mattress flexed as if someone had pressed down on them from beneath, tried to ignore the creak of the roof beam above me groaning as though it bore weight it hadn't before. But when my phone read 2:47 a.m. and I heard the low, hollow chime of a bell that shouldn't have been ringing until 3:13, my heart stumbled, and I felt every hair on my body rise, not in a rush, but in sequence. as though something outside had been reading me one strand at a time. I almost texted my old roommate just to anchor myself, but the bars on my phone were dead, the draft unsent, and I shoved the device under my pillow as though that would keep whatever it was from seeing it. But then came the voice, soft, carried through the thin walls like mist through screens, a voice that called my name with a familiarity that shredded my chest. "Daniel," it whispered. Not desperate, not angry, but coaxing, like a parent trying to lure a frightened child into view. And for half a second, I almost answered, almost broke Rule 2 without realizing it. But then the voice shifted, added the nickname only one person had ever called me in life, Danny, kiddo, and the exact wheezing cadence my father had used, complete with the whistle of air between his teeth he'd carried since pneumonia scarred his lungs. And that was when my blood went cold, because my father had been dead nearly a year, and yet here he was, standing outside Juniper Cabin in the form of his voice, asking me to look, asking me to come closer. I slid off the bunk and crawled beneath it, cheek grinding against grit, heart pounding so hard I could hear the pulse in my ears. And the voice dragged itself along the window frame like fingers tracing a map, promising it found me, promising it had driven all night, promising things only my father could know. And though I never moved, never spoke, every word tightened the knot of terror in my chest until my lungs ached from holding in air. And then, just as quietly, it drifted away toward the lake path, footsteps that never sounded, but presence that lessened, leaving me trembling in the dark. When the actual bell tolled at 3:13, I was already face down on the floorboards, whispering the 4 rules in my head, clinging to them like they were a raft on black water. And though the door handle to Juniper rattled once, testing, it never opened, and the bunk above me stayed empty, except for the faint hiss of salt dissolving in the damp air. When dawn finally came, it bled gray and reluctant over the pines, and the normal clatter of breakfast, the clang of spatulas, the squeak of sneakers, the sudden bursts of children's laughter as the first campers arrived, sounded so wildly out of place, like a dream colliding with a nightmare, that for a long moment I wondered if I had made the entire night up in my head. But when I went down to the dock to splash my face with lake water, the reflection looking back at me in the glassy surface seemed too sharp, too perfect, as though it was more interested in memorizing me than mirroring me. And when Ro appeared beside me with coffee and clipboard, asking if I had slept, I just shook my head, because how could I tell her that the lake had spoken in my father's voice, and worse, that I had nearly answered? By lunchtime, I had settled into a costume of competence, the kind you wear so the kids believe you. A bright staff shirt stretched over a heart that kept glancing toward the lake. I poured milk, sprayed sunscreen clouds, refereed an argument about who owned a purple lanyard, and pretended the 4 rules were simply safety theater. Under the noise, last night pressed its thumbprint on every thought. When the generator hiccuped, I flinched. When a spoon clinked the side of a metal cup, I heard the bell in it. Ro caught my eye once and lifted 2 fingers. Cover. Salt. And I nodded like a soldier acknowledging orders already carved on bone. The schedule said swim test after crafts. I walked my cabin down the path, counting heads allowed to keep rhythm, 1 to 12, a dozen small lives orbiting mine. The lake looked ordinary from the dock, the surface stippled by wind. Dragonflies stitching invisible names into the air. Ordinary is what a locked door looks like. I tethered a whistle to my shirt, checked PFD straps, and sent the first pair into the roped lane. They splashed, laughed, pretended to shiver for a dramatic effect. I tried to let that sound rinse my head. The second pair went, then the third. I counted lips moving, not just heads, 1 to 12, again and again like a charm, until the numbers felt like pebbles in my mouth. On the second run, I miscounted. There were 12 kids in my cabin, and yet, for 3 breaths, I saw 13 heads between the ropes. 12 bright caps and 1 pale, smooth dome like a mushroom breaking the surface. I blinked hard against glare. The extra head flattened and became a flip of sun. The whistle felt heavy against my collarbone. I made myself look at their faces, not their number. Mina, small, serious, treaded water and lifted her chin toward the outer buoy. "Do you see him?" she mouthed. I pretended not to understand and waved her in. "Great job," I said, doing the voice I'd heard other counselors use, the one that sounds like they are stapling gold stars to the day. The test ended without a single cough. I logged their names in swim bands and told myself my eyes had invented that extra cap because fear makes quantity into a bad idea. After swim test, we dried towels on a line that snapped like a flag. A boy found a flat rock with a perfect hole through the center and told me it was a lucky eye. I wanted to tell him to throw it back. Instead, I said, "Cool find," and pocketed the rock so he wouldn't. When we returned to Juniper for rest hour, Mina tugged my sleeve and pointed under her bunk. A small pearl-lidded compact sat in the dust, not camp issue. I opened it and saw my eye swell fish big in the tiny glass. The rule about mirrors is clear. It doesn't care if the glass is the size of a lake or a postage stamp. I shut the compact and wrapped it in one of the black cloths from my stack, knotting the corners so it looked like a little sleeping animal. "Weird makeup," Mina said. "Lost and found," I told her, even though I wasn't taking it anywhere near the box of single socks and unclaimed visors. Afternoon canoes are usually my favorite. The slow rhythm, the way kids find teamwork without realizing it. Today, the cadence felt like a metronome keeping time for something else. I paired them carefully, kept us inside the cove, and watched the far shore out of the corner of my eye. A gust misaligned two boats. Panic is contagious at 11. I waded in, water cold around my calves, and steadied a bow with my palm. The lake smelled like iron and pennies. Beneath the surface, my reflection bent with the ripples. Then for a beat, where the wind died, didn't bend at all, holding still as glass while my actual body shifted above it. I stepped back so fast I kicked silt. "You're okay," I told the kids, certain that the sentence was meant as much for me. Back on land, I found Ro in the equipment shed inventorying paddles. "You're pale," she said, which is something pale people hate. I showed her the compact. She didn't touch it. "It's not ours," she said, which seemed like the whole problem. "Cover it at dusk. Don't look in it after." I wanted a better answer, but the day's heat had made all the words soft. She added, softer, "If you hear your name again, remember the second rule is for you too, not just the kids." I nodded, dimly ashamed that I needed the reminder. Dinner was noodles and red sauce ladled by the gallon. The mess hall buzzed like a hive. Safety lives in crowds until it doesn't. I made stupid faces to earn an easy laugh, told a story about a goose that stole a counselor's shoe, and felt normal for almost 7 minutes. Then the generator coughed, and every overhead bulb dipped by a shade. Conversation thinned to a murmur. The lights steadied. The room exhaled. I caught the director watching the windows, not the kids. When her gaze slid to me, she lifted 2 fingers, the way Ro had, and I wondered how many summers it takes for warning to become your only language. Dusk's approach is loud here if you know how to listen. Crickets tune, lake birds go quiet, and the pines begin a whisper that isn't quite wind. I made my rounds fast. Bathroom vanity, wardrobe door, a picture frame with a sneaky reflective glass. Nails heard their work and approved. In each cabin, I salted the empty bunk, a clean white seam like a scar across the mattress. The act calmed me, the way repetitive tasks do when the brain is a beehive. In Juniper, Mina sat cross-legged with a book and asked if ghosts could swim. I said they float before I could grab the word back and hide it. She accepted that like a weather report. Night bell at 9, toothbrush chorus, lights out bargaining. I settled in the counselor's alcove, compact bundled and tucked beneath my pillow so no one else would find it. For a while, I listened to the soft, domesticated noises of sleep. Fans, sighs, the creak that means someone has turned over and is safe. I must have dozed because when I woke, the room had that thick middle-of-the-night quality like water in the lungs. My phone.
That night began with the simple routine of covering gloss, but even as I nailed cloth squares over the cabin mirrors, I felt the rules breathing down my neck like a set of unseen eyes, reminding me of the compact I had bundled under my pillow, a heartbeat of trouble I didn't dare throw away. And though the kids had drifted into sleep with their limbs sprawled in tangle and their whispers trailing off into dream, I could sense the weight of Juniper Cabin bending with something else, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The storm had rolled in by then, thunder cracking like distant gunfire, the lake glowing with the pale reflection of lightning. And while I walked rounds with my red flashlight, the shadows seemed to lean toward me rather than away, as though the entire camp wanted to overhear my breathing. When I reached the infirmary porch, rain slicking the boards beneath my boots, I froze because through the window I could see the medicine cabinet mirror, cloth nailed in place. But in the reflection, the door behind me was wide open, while in reality it remained firmly latched, the handle trembling just once, as though a hand had tried it. I backed away slowly, salt tin clutched like a weapon, but when I reached Juniper and slipped inside, my relief evaporated at the sight of the compact lying open on the empty bunk, its pearl lid folded back, mirrors shining like a miniature lake that seemed to ripple without touch. I tied the black cloth tighter this time, double knots that bit into my fingers, and tucked it deep into my trunk. But even with it hidden, the air felt wet, charged, heavy with a waiting kind of hunger. By the time the bell began to toll at exactly 3:13 a.m., my body was already pressed to the floorboards, face down, trying to breathe as quietly as possible, while the door eased open against the hymn book I had wedged beneath it, a scraping protest drowned out by the second toll of the bell, deeper, closer, vibrating in my chest. Something stepped into the room, not footsteps, but the idea of them, the boards groaning in sequence as weight shifted from one end of the cabin to the other. And when the third toll sounded, the empty, salted bunk moaned like springs under strain, as though a body heavier than any child was lowering itself into place. I pressed my forehead into the wood, praying the salt would hold, but then I heard the faint hiss of grains dissolving like foam swallowed by tide, and a voice, not my father's this time, but a child's, whispered the names of constellations: Orion, Draco, Lyra, each syllable falling exactly where my heartbeat struck, like it was timing itself to me. I clenched my jaw and recited the rules silently, afraid that even the movement of my lips might be taken as an answer. And when the bell ceased after what felt like an eternity, the air released its grip, leaving the cabin hollow once more. And though the door clicked shut and the bunk above me lightened as if whatever had been there rolled away into nothing, I stayed face down until the sun bled gray across the pines, my body aching from the stillness, my throat raw from holding back a scream that had been trying to claw its way free all night. And as I finally sat up and brushed salt grains from my hair, I knew without question that the rules weren't strange traditions or paranoia, they were lifelines. And the terrifying truth was that even when you followed them perfectly, something still tried to find a way through.
By the time the kids barreled into breakfast, shouting over who got the blue cup and who poured too much syrup, I was wearing the same hollow smile as the other counselors. The kind that says, "We're fine, nothing happened, eat your eggs and be normal." But inside my chest, my heart was still beating like a drum muffled under layers of cloth. And when Mina leaned across the table to ask me why there were salt grains stuck in my hair, I almost told her everything. Almost confessed that something had pressed into Juniper Cabin last night and spoken to me in a child's voice while dissolving the one barrier meant to keep it out. But I caught myself, because the rules weren't just to protect me, they were to protect them. And if the kids learned why we followed them, they'd never sleep again. Still, Mina kept staring, her small eyes sharp in a way that suggested she saw more than she should. And when she whispered, "Don't let anyone take the empty bed," I felt my skin crawl, because that wasn't the kind of sentence an 11-year-old should invent casually. After breakfast, we led the campers toward the field for archery drills, a safe daytime distraction, the kind of activity that normally would have felt wholesome and lighthearted, but I couldn't shake the weight of what I'd seen in the mirror's reflection, or the compact lying open on the salted bunk like a baited trap. I forced cheer into my voice, joked about arrows being pointless without targets, and listened to their laughter ring like protection. But then I noticed Mina wasn't laughing. She was staring at the tree line where the pines leaned toward the lake, and when I followed her gaze, I froze. because there was someone standing on the far pier, a silhouette too far to identify, arm raised in a deliberate wave, slow and repetitive, a gesture not of greeting but of invitation. I blew my whistle and called the kids back inside with the excuse of storm drill practice, heart hammering so loud I was sure they heard it. Once we were safe in the lodge, I found the director and stammered at what I'd seen, but she only pressed her lips together and said, "It wants you to believe you can be polite to it," before sending the children off with craft supplies and leaving me to stew in my dread. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of construction paper and glitter, my mind snapping back again and again to the wave on the pier and the soft hiss of salt disappearing beneath phantom weight. And by dinner, I felt like a cracked cup holding back a flood. That night, when dusk slid across camp like a black cloth of its own, I hurried through my rounds, covering mirrors until my hands ached, salting bunks with enough precision that the grains made neat white scars across the mattresses. And when I returned to Juniper, the kids already tucked in, I found the compact lying once more on the empty bed. The cloth I'd knotted 3 times loosened as though fingers had undone it. My throat closed, but I forced myself to grab the compact, wrap it again, and shove it beneath my mattress, whispering apologies to no one as I pressed it down. At lights out, the cabin fell still, the children's breathing a fragile rhythm I clung to, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this night would pass quietly if I respected every rule down to the syllable. But at 3:13, the bell rang, and I hit the floor face down before the first echo faded, body rigid, heart wild, and I felt the door to Juniper open again, slower this time, deliberate, followed by a draft that smelled of iron and algae, the smell of the lake itself. Boards groaned as something entered, and the salted bunk sighed under phantom weight, the sound so heavy it bent the air. And then came the voice, not my father's, not a stranger's, but Mina's, whispering my name with a softness so real I almost forgot she was asleep 2 bunks away. And when the voice said, "Danny, please look, it's safe now," I clenched my teeth until they hurt, reciting the rules in my head like commandments, reminding myself that nothing, not even the borrowed voice of a child, could make it safe to break them. The compact shifted under my mattress with a faint click, the lid prying open on its own. And in the darkness, I felt the pull of reflection, an urge to raise my eyes and see whatever face had borrowed Mina's voice, but I pressed my forehead harder into the floorboards and forced myself to name trees, pine, cedar, spruce, until the bell stopped and the pressure lifted, leaving the cabin hollow again. When dawn finally broke, the compact was back on the empty bunk, cloth untied, mirror shining like a patch of water in the gray light, and I realized with a sinking certainty that the rules weren't just guidelines, they were bargains. And every night I survived was only because the camp allowed it. Not because I was strong or careful, but because whatever lived in the lake hadn't yet decided I was worth the effort.
By the 4th day, I had learned to wear the rules like gear. Cloth stacked in my pocket like spare lungs, salt tins clinking at my hip, a hymn book under my arm for the door wedge I pretended was tradition. The kids believed in talent shows and tetherball records, while we believed in not teaching the water our names, and not split reality made everything feel like a stage set built over a sinkhole, pretty until someone jumped. After lunch, when the heat turned the ball field into a mirage and we called quiet hour, I found Ro at the chapel steps sipping from a dented thermos and staring at the lake as if it were a person who might finally tell the truth. I sat beside her and asked, gently, so she could say no, what happened here before the laminated rules? She turned the thermos slowly, thinking, then told me the story people insisted was folklore because it felt safer classified that way. Camp Graywater began as a church retreat, lodge set directly over a spring that fed the lake in a tone the old folks swore you could hear through the floorboards, a low traveling note like a throat clearing in another room. One summer of drought, the spring didn't stop. It shifted, appearing where it hadn't been and leaving dry where it had, until one night water rose in the chapel cellar and lopped the hymnals stocked on a table. A boy from a visiting choir sleepwalked, opened the cellar door, went down into that black and glassy room, and didn't come back when his sister called. The search went on for 3 days, then 3 weeks, the lake fed by 3 new inlets no map showed. The mother stayed on the chapel pew waiting for the door to open, And when it finally did, weeks later, wind or not, the story says she looked up too fast and broke her own neck. But Rose said that part was the polite version told to strangers. The impolite version is that something climbed the steps almost to the landing and then stopped because someone had taught it there were doors you do not walk through if someone is facing the floor. This, she said, is why the bell rings when it does and why the rules are phrased without poetry. Cover, don't answer, leave one empty, lie down. They aren't magic, she added, scraping mud from her boot with a stick. They're the narrow door we still fit through. I wanted to ask if the boy ever came back, but questions like that feel like feeding time. So instead I asked if it ever learns new things. Only what we teach it, she said, which is why you never count aloud at the dock. I thought of the afternoon I'd been counting heads like charms and felt cold under the sun. We walked the camp together as thunderheads muscled up behind the far ridge, the light going green around the edges in that way that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. At Juniper, I checked the compact, knots intact, at least for now, and salted the empty bunk with a care bordering on prayer, while Ro watched the window screen with her head tilted as if listening for an accent. On storm nights, it tries to negotiate. With what? I asked. Credentials, voices you'll open the door for. We made a circuit to every cabin, reminding counselors to pull shades, cover mirrors, talk loud and silly until lights out to keep the sound in the room big and human. At dinner, the generator flickered once and the entire hall went silent in a single inhale. I made the table laugh by telling them noodles were tiny lake snakes boiled for our safety, and they squealed on cue, which for 1 minute felt like a charm that might actually hold. After dishes, the director called a staff huddle and assigned partners for rounds. I was with Ro, which steadied me, like being handed a lantern with more oil than mine. Dusk fell hard, as it does when weather's coming, and we moved quick, our cloths slick with damp as we nailed them over every sly shard of reflection. Rain began as polite taps, and then forgot its manners. Lightning stitched the clouds and showed the lake in flashes, too bright, too still. A counselor radio crackled with a request for more salt and then died mid-sentence. And in the sudden quiet, a far bell, too far to be ours, answered nothing with a single, hollow note. We finished our circuit and ducked into Juniper just before lights out. The girls were restless, storm high, electricity in their hair. I told a ridiculous story about a raccoon that ran for office and lost by 1 vote because it had counted itself out loud, and the room laughed until the bell tone in my memory dulled a notch. Lights out, fans humming, rain bruising the roof. I lay on the floor early, cheek to plank, compact bundled and wedged beneath the cot leg so it could not migrate without dragging furniture, hymn books jammed tight at the door. Rose squeezed my shoulder before stepping out. Remember, boring saves lives. I nodded, even though everything in me wanted to be anything but boring. At 3:13, the bell began, not a clang so much as a deep, shaped breath, and I was already face down, hands flat, teeth counting rules against my tongue. The handle turned, polite as a handshake. The door pushed against the book and paused as if reading the title. Water smell rolled over me, iron, algae, the mineral ghost of old coins. Boards answered in soft replies as weight moved through the room. The salted bunk gave that slow, awful compression. Above me, dust sifted onto my neck like a blessing spoken by someone who doesn't mean it. From the window came a whisper and my father's wheeze, then another and a child's sing-song, and then worst of all, my own voice from last afternoon saying, "Great job," in that stapled gold star tone, and I understood the credential Ro meant. Not just family, not just kids, but me, the one person I might turn my head for without thinking. I buried my face harder in the floor and named trees again. Pine, cedar, spruce, larch, until the bell let go of the last note, and the door rested back in its frame. I didn't move until the rain thinned to threads. When I finally sat up, the compact was still under the cot leg where I'd left it. Knots taut, cloth cold. I wanted to laugh or cry or peel the rules off my skin and run, but instead I brushed salt from my hair, checked the empty bed, and whispered thank you to the boring morning that always somehow still arrived.
The storm had wrung us all out by morning, leaving the camp soggy and heavy, puddles shining like broken mirrors across the paths. And while the kids groaned about mud on their sneakers, I felt the weight of what I'd survived tightening in my chest like a belt, though I couldn't say a word because how do you tell 11-year-olds that their bedtime songs and the weight on their bunks had been used as credentials by something waiting outside? Instead, I whistled and clapped and herded them toward the dining hall with the same plastic brightness every counselor wore, but all the while my eyes kept dragging toward the lake, half expecting to see another wave, another silhouette pretending to be human. Breakfast chatter was loud, almost painfully so, as though the noise itself was an act of defiance. And yet even in that chaos, I heard Mina's whisper. She had leaned close, a spoon dangling in her hand, and murmured, "The salt line was thinner this morning." Words that landed like pebbles in my stomach, because I had checked it myself and laid it thick. So if it was thinner, someone or something had been there after me. I told her gently to eat her eggs and not to talk about it again, but her eyes were too steady, too knowing, like she had walked these rules long before I ever arrived. That afternoon, we tried to reset with camp activities, capture the flag, friendship bracelets, a scavenger hunt through the wet woods. But I couldn't stop noticing how every game seemed to circle back toward the empty bunk, the covered mirrors, the lake, as if the whole camp was a wheel and those rules its hub. When one boy complained about not getting to sleep on the top bunk like his brother, I forced a laugh and explained the late arrivals bed rule again, but he frowned and muttered, "What if they actually arrive?" And though his words were careless, they hollowed me out. By dusk, the sky bruised purple, the air still humming with leftover storm energy, and I hurried the kids inside, covering glass and sprinkling salt with the precision of ritual, each grain a prayer I didn't know how to say out loud. I made my rounds with extra care, but just as I hammered the cloth over the wardrobe mirror, I caught a flash in the corner of my eye. The compact, somehow unwrapped again, lying open under the empty bunk as if it had slithered across the floor while I wasn't looking. The mirror inside rippling faintly like water, even though there was no breeze, no touch. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to grab it, cover it, knot it twice, and slide it back beneath my mattress, though the knots already felt looser by the time my hands left them. The kids fell asleep more slowly that night, whispers stretching long after lights out, and when at last their breathing settled, I lay down with my face pressed to the floorboards, hymn book at the door, waiting for the inevitable. The bell's first toll at 3:13 was softer than before, almost curious, and the door eased open just enough to let in the smell of wet iron, algae, and old coins. The boards creaked as something crossed the room, deliberate, weight-shifting, until the empty salted bunk took on a groan that was nearly a sigh, as though whoever or whatever climbed into it was bone-tired from waiting all these years. I didn't move, didn't grieve more than I had to, but then came the whisper, low and sweet, Mina's voice this time, except it wasn't her. It was too precise, too rehearsed, as though something had recorded her and was playing it back with cruel care. "Coach, don't be scared, you can look now," it said. And I wanted nothing more than to lift my head and see if she was awake, if she was safe, if she was even real anymore. But the second rule screamed in my skull, "Don't answer, don't look, don't engage," and I clenched my jaw until it hurt, reciting trees again, pine, cedar, spruce, larch, oak, maple, birch, refusing to give the thing what it wanted. Then, as if insulted, the voice changed, layering others over Mina's, my father's, Rose, even my own voice from earlier in the day, each one coaxing, bargaining, pleading, and the compact beneath my mattress clicked open with a metallic snap, its mirror humming like a second bell. And for a moment I thought the weight on the upper bunk would break through the salt entirely, but then just as suddenly as it began, the bell tolled once more and the air released, the door clicked shut, and the bunk lightened, leaving only silence and the sound of rainwater dripping from the eaves. I stayed down until dawn, every muscle cramped, every thought raw, and when the kids finally stirred, stretching and laughing about dreams of water horses and storm dragons, I wanted to shake them and say, "This isn't a dream. This is survival. These rules are the only reason you're here." But instead, I smiled and asked them who wanted pancakes, because at Camp Graywater,
pretending to be boring was the bravest thing you could do. By the 5th night, the camp felt like a wound that refused to close, edges raw and weeping. And even though the sun had burned the puddles dry and laughter spilled across the fields like nothing had ever happened, I could feel the lake tugging at me, patient as a spider, waiting for the one moment I'd forget the rules. I kept myself busy, shouting encouragement at canoe races, referee and capture the flag, teaching a girl to whistle with 2 fingers, anything to keep my mind loud. But the silence that fell whenever I turned toward the water was louder still, as though the entire surface leaned closer to listen. By now I'd given up trying to convince myself the rules were a superstition. Every night had driven a nail deeper into that coffin. And what terrified me most wasn't the thought of breaking them, but the way the thing in the lake had started to learn me, using my father's cadence, Mina's whisper, even my own voice like masks it could wear whenever it wanted. That evening during the campfire, as kids roasted marshmallows and shouted over who got the biggest flame, I watched the sparks climb into the night and thought about how easy it would be for them to land on dry pine and set the whole valley alight. And part of me envied fire for its honesty, because at least you could see it coming, smell it, run from it, while the thing in the lake was nothing but patience wrapped in imitation. After the s'mores were gone and the songs had thinned into tired giggles, I shepherded Juniper Cabin back to their bunks, watching Mina closely because she had become my compass in all this, her eyes always a beat ahead of what the rest of us sensed, but even she seemed subdued, clutching her blanket like it was armor. I made the rounds with my cloth and nails, hammering fast and hard, covering every sly surface of glass, then salted the empty bunk with such precision that the seam glittered like frost, whispering the rules in my head like a catechism. Cover, don't answer, leave empty, lie down. And when the last child's breathing smoothed into sleep, I crawled to the floor with my hymn book and lay flat, cheek pressed to the boards, heart a fist in my throat. The bell tolled not at 3:13 this time, but at 3:10, early by 3 minutes that stretched like years, and I realized with horror that it was testing me, trying to lure me into thinking the pattern was broken, that maybe the rules didn't apply if the hour shifted. But I stayed down, hands flat, eyes closed, repeating the commandments of survival, while the door handle rattled, wood groaning, the hymn book straining against weight that pushed harder than ever before. The bell tolled again, deeper, slower, and a draft swept across the cabin floor, damp and smelling of algae and rusted iron. And the compact under my bunk snapped open with a sound that vibrated in my teeth, its mirror pulsing like a second heart. And then came the voices, not 1 or 2 this time, but a chorus, all the kids in my cabin speaking at once in perfect unison. Coach, we need you. Coach, look at us. Coach, it's safe now. Each phrase cutting into me like hooks because part of me wanted nothing more than to leap up and protect them, to prove I wasn't a coward pressed to the floor, but I forced myself to remember the second rule, don't answer, don't look, and I buried my face deeper, whispering trees, pine, cedar, spruce, larch, oak, maple, birch, chestnut, elm, sycamore. Above, the empty salted bunks sagged under impossible weight, salt grains snapping like firecrackers as they dissolved. And I thought, this is it. This is the night it finally breaks through. But then the bell tolled a 3rd time and everything froze. The door easing shut, the bunk sighing with sudden emptiness, the chorus of voices snuffed out like candles. And silence returned, heavy and merciless, leaving me shaking so badly I could hardly unclench my jaw. When dawn crept through the window, pale and reluctant, I sat up and found the compact on top of the empty bunk again, unwrapped, lid wide, mirror gleaming as if it had never been touched. And for the first time, I thought about smashing it, breaking the glass into shards and scattering them into the woods. But even as the idea sparked, another thought followed. What if that was exactly what it wanted? What if shards meant more mouths, more ways in? And I left it where it lay, covering it again with shaking hands. At breakfast, Mina stared at me across the table, lips pale, and said softly enough that only I could hear, "It's learning faster now." And though I wanted to laugh it off, to tell her kids shouldn't talk like that, I knew she was right, because last night it hadn't just used familiar voices, it had tried them all at once. And the next time I feared, it wouldn't be asking me to look, it would be telling me I already had.
By the 6th night, I stopped pretending to myself that I could keep this up without breaking, because exhaustion had carved me into something brittle, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the compact lid twitching, the empty bunk dipping, or worse, the reflection of my own face holding still while I moved above it. So when the director announced another storm drill at dinner, even though the sky was clear, I knew it was code for something she didn't want to say in front of the kids, and my stomach turned heavy as stone. After the plates were cleared and the laughter thinned, we counselors circled near the chapel, flashlights off, the only light the moon shivering on the lake, and she told us that once a season, the rules fray, that the bell rings out of turn, that reflections start moving differently, that the thing in the water grows impatient and tests new routes, and all we could do was cling harder to the instructions already etched into us. I wanted to ask her what happened if the rules failed completely, if one night we'd lie face down and the door would open anyway, but she cut off my thought with a stare that suggested she already knew the answer and didn't dare say it out loud. That night in Juniper, I salted the bunk 3 times, poured so much it looked like a snowdrift, then hammered the black cloth so deep into the frames that my fingers blistered, but still the air carried that taste of rust, and I knew no amount of preparation would ever feel enough. The kids eventually settled, Mina curling tight under her blanket, eyes open long after the others, and I whispered to her across the dark that everything would be fine, though the words felt like smoke in my mouth, fragile and dissolving. When the bell tolled, not at 3:13, but at 3 sharp, the sound made my teeth ache, a deeper tone than any I'd heard before, and the hymn book at the door skidded back an inch under pressure before stopping as if an unseen hand had decided to give me mercy for one more night. But then the compact snapped open and the cabin filled with a reflection that wasn't confined to its tiny glass anymore. It spread across the ceiling, a lake overhead, rippling with silver moonlight, and in that mirrored water I saw all 12 kids floating, their eyes open, their mouths moving, whispering words I couldn't hear because they were under glass. I pressed my face harder to the floor, whispering the rules like they were beads on a rosary, but the voices in the reflection got louder until they broke through the barrier, echoing in my skull. Not begging this time, but commanding, "Answer, Daniel, answer, answer," each syllable hitting like the toll of the bell itself. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound was inside me, vibrating my ribs, and when I risked the smallest glance to the side, I saw salt sizzling off the empty bunk, smoke rising where the grains had once been. The mattress sagging under weight that made the frame scream in protest. The reflection on the ceiling rippled, one of the floating children breaking the surface, and to my horror, it wasn't Mina or any of the campers. It was me, my own face, pale and slack, lifting from the water with eyes too still, mouth opening to say the one word that would undo everything. Look. My whole body convulsed, every nerve ending telling me to respond, to acknowledge, to prove I was still human by breaking the silence, but I forced my teeth to grind down until my jaw ached, and I shouted the rules silently in my skull like a drumbeat. Cover Miri, don't answer, leave one bunk empty, face down. And with each repetition, I imagined hammering another nail into the invisible coffin I wanted this thing to stay in. The bell tolled again. 3:13 exactly this time, as if mocking me, and the weight on the bunk lifted, the reflection drained from the ceiling like water down a hole, and silence pressed in, complete and suffocating. But the cost was written on my body. Sweat soaked every inch of my clothes, my nails dug blood into my palms, and my throat burned from holding back words that had nearly escaped. When dawn finally crawled across the pines, I sat up shaking, the compact back on the bunk, unwrapped, gleaming like an invitation. And Mina was sitting up too, her blanket around her shoulders, whispering just one thing. It knows your name now. Not the one you use, the one you keep inside. And I couldn't ask her how she knew, because the hollow in her eyes told me she hadn't been asleep at all. She had seen the reflection too, and somehow she understood before I did that the rules weren't keeping it out anymore. They were only slowing it down.
By the 7th dawn, I understood the truth that had been chewing at me since my first night at Camp Graywater, that the rules were never meant to defeat the thing in the lake, only to delay it, to make our nights survivable one by one, like flipping cards on a table while praying the ace never turns. And I knew as I salted the empty bunk for what might be the last time,
that patience is a resource, and the lake had more of it than we ever could. The children would be leaving in 2 days, vans lined up on the gravel road to take them back to parents who'd never know what hunted their laughter here. And maybe that was the real reason for the rules, to stretch time just long enough to send the kids home whole. But for us, the counselors, the director, even Ro, there was no exit strategy, only the knowledge that the camp required keepers, bodies to lie flat at 313 and take the weight so the next summer could happen. And though I wanted to believe I'd be different, that I'd leave and never come back, the compact waiting on the bunk told me I was already marked. That night, the air was sharp as glass, moonlight making the lake into a sheet of steel. And even before the bell tolled, the cabin felt wrong, the boards flexing under invisible steps, the compact opening with a snap that echoed like a gunshot, its mirror flaring so bright it threw shadows of all 13 bunks across the walls. Not 12, 13, as though it had already claimed its space. The kids stirred, restless, Mina clutching her blanket like armor, and I whispered for them to stay still, though my words came out as vapor, already stolen by the draft seeping through the cracked door. Then the bell rang, not once, but a cascade, 5 strikes in perfect rhythm, louder than I'd ever heard, rattling nails from the mirror cloths, making salt dance like static across the bunks. And I threw myself flat, cheek grinding against wood, repeating the rules with the desperation of a drowning man counting strokes. But the rules no longer sounded like protection. They sounded like jokes told too many times, brittle and empty. And above me, the empty bunk took weight so massive the frame split, wood shrieking as if something enormous had folded itself into child-sized space. And I smelled water, not the surface-like water, but deep water, the kind that never sees sun, heavy with stone and old coins and silt. And then came the voices, not borrowed this time, but blended. Every voice I had ever trusted in my life. My father, my mother, my first teacher, my roommate, even Ro, all speaking at once, urging me to look, to answer, to finally give in. And when I refused, when I pressed my face harder into the floor, it spoke in my own voice again. But not just repeating me, it spoke my thoughts, the ones I hadn't said out loud, whispering them back to me with perfect cadence, proving it had been inside my skull all along. I screamed silently into the boards, clutching the hymn book as if words on paper could hold anything back. But the door swung wide, hinges shrieking, and in the gap I saw not a shape, but the absence of one, a subtraction of light and meaning that made my eyes water. And from it stretched a reflection across the floor, like a second surface. And I saw myself standing there in that reflection, head lifted, eyes wide, mouth opening to answer, while my real body lay pressed to the ground. And I realized in a sick rush that I had already lost, because if the reflection answered, the rules didn't matter anymore. The bell tolled one final time, a note so deep it cracked the air, and the reflection me whispered yes before I could stop it. And every grain of salt in the cabin hissed to nothing, every cloth ripped free as though cut by unseen knives. Every mirror in camp gleamed awake, and the compact's glass flared like an open mouth. For one endless second, the cabin was filled with water light, rippling shadows of things too large to name pressing against the walls, and the kids moaned in their sleep, their dreams pulled taut as fishing lines. And I thought we were all going to be dragged under, that Camp Graywater would finally take what it had been promised decades ago. But then Mina's voice cut through, high and sharp, shouting the rules aloud with the force of someone who had no business knowing them so well, her tiny voice making the air tremble. Cover mirrors, don't answer, leave one bunk empty, lie face down. And the reflection flinched, just for a moment, like a stage light snapping. And in that blink, I rolled to my knees, slammed the compact shut with both hands, and wrapped it in the black cloth until my knuckles bled from the pressure of the knots. The reflection of me dissolved, the door slammed hard enough to splinter its frame, and the bell stopped mid-echo, leaving a silence so total I thought I had gone deaf. When dawn came, every mirror was covered again, every salt line restored, and the kids woke yawning and laughing as though nothing had happened. But I knew, and Mina knew, that the camp had only let us survive because it had been reminded that even prey can bite if cornered. As the vans pulled up later that day, their doors slamming with the promise of safety, I stood at the edge of the lake, compact heavy in my pocket, and wondered if I would truly ever leave, because Camp Graywater doesn't let go. It just waits, summer after summer, bell after bell,
until the rules stop being lifelines and become chains. And I could already hear the echo of that final toll deep in my skull, promising me that when the next 313 arrived, it would not be satisfied with reflections anymore. It would want me. And the worst part was that some quiet, exhausted part of me already wanted to give in.
And that was my summer at Camp Graywater. The kids went home smiling, none the wiser, but the rest of us knew the truth. The rules don't keep the lake away, they just keep it patient. One day, it'll take more than rules to stop it. Until then, all we can do is lie flat at 313 and pray it doesn't decide tonight is the night. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Echoes After Midnight for more terrifying tales that will keep you up long after the lights go out. And remember, ordinary places hide extraordinary horrors.